Washington families are already paying some of the highest fuel prices in America. Electric rates are climbing, natural gas rates are climbing, groceries cost more than they did just a few years ago. Now Washington State is moving forward toward linking its carbon market with California and Quebec, creating one massive carbon trading system. State officials say this could stabilize prices and lower costs. Critics say Washington is about to hand over control of a major part of its energy economy to California. Tonight, we're breaking down what this proposal actually means, why it matters, and whether Washington families should expect to pay even more in the years ahead. From Seattle to Los Angeles, this is Left Coast News. No apologies, just the truth. Welcome back to Left Coast News. If you're new here, we focus on the policies, politics, and economic issues impacting Washington, Oregon, and California. Tonight, we're looking at a proposal that most people have never heard of, but could affect everything from fuel prices to utility bills. It's called carbon market linkage. And while it sounds boring enough to cure insomnia, it could have very real consequences for every household in Washington state. What is Washington's carbon market? Let's start with the basics. Washington's Climate Commitment Act created what's known as a cap and invest program. Under the system, large emitters must purchase carbon allowances for the greenhouse gases they produce. Think of these allowances as government-issued permits. Oil refineries need them, natural gas utilities need them, major industrial facilities need them. If you emit carbon above a certain threshold, you have to buy allowances at auction. The state limits how many allowances exist. That creates scarcity. Scarcity creates higher prices, and higher prices are intended to encourage businesses to reduce emissions. That's the theory. The reality is that businesses don't simply absorb these costs. They pass them on to you. That's exactly what happened after Washington launched the program in 2023. Allowance prices came in significantly higher than many state projections. Fuel suppliers immediately faced new compliance costs. Those costs worked their way through the supply chain, and Washington suddenly found itself with some of the highest gas prices in the nation. For families already struggling with inflation, that wasn't an academic exercise. It was a very real hit to their wallets. Now Washington wants to join California. The Department of Ecology is now pursuing linkage with California and Quebec. Instead of Washington operating its own standalone carbon market, all three jurisdictions would effectively share one giant marketplace. State officials argue this would create several benefits: a larger market, more buyers and sellers, greater stability, lower price volatility, and potentially lower allowance costs. Their argument is fairly straightforward. California's market is much larger, it's more mature, it has more participants, and historically, its allowance prices have often been more stable than Washington's. The state's position is that connecting Washington's market to California's could act as a pressure relief valve. Instead of being trapped in a smaller market with occasional price spikes, Washington companies could access a much larger pool of allowances. On paper, that sounds reasonable, but there are some important concerns. The question of control. This is where many critics start getting nervous. Once Washington links to California's system, Washington no longer has complete control over its own carbon market. The price of allowances would increasingly be influenced by decisions made outside Washington. Think about that for a second. California lawmakers and regulators could make decisions that affect energy costs for Washington residents. If California tightens its cap aggressively, allowance prices could rise throughout the entire linked market. Washington consumers would feel those impacts even though they had no vote in California politics. For many people, this isn't just an economic issue, it's a governance issue. Who should control Washington's energy policy? Olympia or Sacramento? The California track record. This is another reason many Washington residents are skeptical. California has some of the highest fuel costs in America, some of the highest electricity costs, some of the highest regulatory costs. Now, to be fair, carbon markets are not solely responsible for those prices. There are many factors involved: taxes, environmental regulations, renewable energy mandates, fuel formulation requirements, labor costs, land use policies, the list goes on. But critics argue that linking Washington's carbon market to California effectively ties Washington's future to a state already known for high energy costs. And that's where many people began asking whether this is the first step toward importing more of California's economic model. What happens to your gas prices? This is the question everyone wants answered. The honest answer is nobody knows with certainty. State officials believe linkage could reduce compliance costs, and if compliance costs fall, some pressure could come off fuel prices. That's the optimistic scenario. The skeptical scenario is different. The entire purpose of these carbon markets is to make fossil fuel more progressively more expensive over time. That's not a criticism. That's literally how the system is designed. The goal is to encourage a transition away from gasoline, diesel, and natural gas. If that's the objective, then the long-term direction of travel remains the same. Carbon becomes more expensive. Compliance becomes more expensive. And those costs continue flowing downstream to consumers. The question isn't whether pressure exists. The question is whether linkage slows that pressure or accelerates it. Electricity and natural gas. The issue extends far beyond fuel. Washington families are already seeing utility increases. Puget Sound Energy customers have experienced significant rate increases. Natural gas customers continue facing upward pressure. Utilities subject to carbon compliance costs often seek recovery of those expenses through rates. Eventually, those costs show up on monthly bills. When policymakers say businesses are paying for carbon allowances, remember something important. Businesses don't have wallets. Consumers do. Every major cost imposed on a utility, refinery, trucking company, shipping company, or manufacturer eventually ends up somewhere. And most of the time, it ends up on your bill. The grocery store connection. One thing politicians rarely mention is the hidden impact on food prices. Everything in a grocery store moves on diesel. Farm equipment uses fuel, food processors use energy, warehouses use electricity, trucks use fuel. When energy costs rise throughout the supply chain, food costs often rise too. It's rarely one dramatic increase. It's death by 1,000 cuts. A few cents here, a few cents there, $1 more on one item, $2 more on another. Eventually, families notice they're spending hundreds more every month than they were just a few years ago, which I'm sure you are right now. The trust problem. There is another challenge facing state officials: credibility. Many Washington residents remember being told the Climate Commitment Act would have minimal impact on fuel prices. Then allowance prices surged, fuel costs climbed, and the public was told the situation was more complicated than expected. Well, maybe it was. But once government forecasts miss reality, public trust becomes harder to maintain. That skepticism now follows every new promise about carbon policy. When officials say linkage will lower costs, many Washington residents respond with a simple question: how accurate were the last projections? The debate over linking Washington's carbon market with California and Quebec is ultimately about more than climate policy. It's about affordability. It's about accountability. And it's about who controls the economic future of Washington state. Supporters see a larger, more stable market that could reduce volatility and lower compliance costs. Critics see Washington becoming increasingly tied to California's regulatory decisions and long-term energy strategy. What everyone can agree on is this: the costs won't stay inside government spreadsheets. They'll show up in gas prices, utility bills, shipping costs, and grocery receipts. Because every policy eventually arrives at someone's kitchen table. And when it does, Washington families will be the ones paying close attention. Thank you for watching Left Coast News. Please like, share, follow, and drop a comment below with your thoughts if you got anything out of this story. What do you think about being tied to California and Quebec in this way? Do you think it will lower costs, or is this just another empty promise from our politicians? Personally, I think it's a really bad idea. Remember, you can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Brighteon, BitChute, Patreon, Facebook, X, Truth Social, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify. Thanks for watching.